Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my disembodied co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Get ready to go against the grain. We have another great show for you today. As you know, the elections in Wisconsin were held yesterday in the midst of a pandemic. You've often heard me say that elections are like holidays on this show, but I think Bob will agree with me. What took place yesterday was not a political holiday. It was an immoral disaster pushed by hacks like Joe Biden and Republican Party in Wisconsin, disregarding the health and life of the various people of those populations entirely for their political ambitions. Shame on all of you. Shame on all of you. We'll have Jim Carpenter from Progressive Democrats of America from Milwaukee to discuss what it was like on the ground with something like 3% of Wisconsin voters braving the disaster in health in order to push their constitutional right to vote. Just to make a point, a rational society does not behave in this way. In the second hour, we'll have comedic political talent of the man that has the greatest resemblance to white Jesus than any man walking the earth today. Host of Redacted Tonight, Lee Camp. He'll be here to discuss my pet political infatuations. What does political accountability mean? What does it look like? What is the left after Sanders? Also, the big news of the day, Trump firing the cop that was supposed to oversee the expenditures of the $2 trillion corporate bailout. Yes, they're throwing crumbs to the masses, but the issue is, where is the bulk of that money going? And the cop that was supposed to be on the beat overseeing it, Trump just got rid of for reasons of, wait for it, disloyalty. Reasons of disloyalty. Last but not least, it's Wednesday. Today is one of my favorite segments, Mysteries. As my producer put it in the promo, and a lot of UFO stuff, that is what an Aries moon in the 8th house opposition Pluto looks like in real life. Personally, I think it adds a unique component to our channel, putting us ahead of the curve on something that elements of the government are clearly trying to expose, but only going as far as we can defend whatever we are saying. That is a unique perspective. Also, today just so happens to be the day that Stephen Greer released his movie, or the very least last night. There's a section of that movie that I wish to discuss because I think Greer is onto something, and it goes beyond UFOs into the hooks of the intelligence community in the way the information is being released to the public about this particular phenomena. It raises concerns that should be discussed that I've been talking about actually for the last 2 years. But let's start here. As I noted in the earlier section, we had an election to occur yesterday. Now, I typically celebrate these elections, grand shows of democracy and all of the political, I'm a political animal, but I will not be celebrating what took place yesterday. Yesterday was a sham. Joe Biden, the Republican Congress legislature in Wisconsin, backed, co-signed by the Republican Supreme Court, held an election in the middle of a pandemic. Our Surgeon General said it would be like a 9/11 moment. 404,056 cases, 3,721 new cases, 12,988 deaths. Joe Biden, the Republican legislature, Supreme Court says, yes, let's have an election on that particular day. Why? Because they wanted to get their political ambitions. The Republican legislature and the Republican Supreme Court pick was up for the vote. The Republican legislature knew and understood that there was an imbalance in the number of Democrats versus Republicans, where Republicans had an advantage. So they needed the election to be held on that date. They didn't care about the life and health of the various people who were going to the polling locations. Needed to be held that day. Joe Biden knows that he can collapse at any moment. He is barely cognitively, absolutely challenged, which means he needs to have that election held on that very specific day. Life and limb of the individuals don't matter. Let that sink in. And nurse a quiet rage about that. And don't let it be quiet for long. Just let that sink in. For their political ambitions, they were willing to risk life and limb of the individuals in Wisconsin. And after all of it's said and done, Joe Biden comes out and says, We probably shouldn't have had that election. Let's hear the clip.
Do you think you won in Wisconsin tonight? Ordinarily, I'd be hitting you over the head with all these exit polls and crosstabs and things that I know about people all the way down to what they like for lunch. We're not going to have anything until Monday. What's your gut?
No, we're not. Well, my gut is that we shouldn't have had the election in the first place. The in-person election. It should have been all mail ballots in. It should have been moved in the way that 5 other states have done it. It's the idea didn't have enough poll workers in over 100 and some polling places in Milwaukee.
That rat bastard. That rat bastard. He had been pushing for this election all the way up until like the day before the election, and now afterwards he turns around and says, yeah, my gut tells me we shouldn't have had that. How stupid do you think people are? You put all of those people's lives over. 70% of the people who died or who got ill were African Americans in the COVID-19 crisis in Chicago. Meaning, the people who you are looking for to put you in that office are the people who are most susceptible to this disease, and you are perfectly willing to put their lives on the line in order to get your decrepit, shuffling, cognitively challenged stuff over the finish line. I was going to have a longer monologue on that. But that's not the news for today. The big news for today is that Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the primary. It hurts. Bernie Sanders has dropped out the primary. Bob Schlehuber, my co-host, my wingman, broke the news to me. He broke it to me like a hospital, like a doctor, breaking into a patient that they had cancer. Because he knew what was going to do to me. Bernie Sanders has dropped out the primaries. How weak. How weak. I've said before that my feelings of Sanders are complicated. And they're complicated in part because I accept that Bernie Sanders has done remarkable things in regards to moving this argument about lefty politics into the mainstream, shifting the Overton window, shifting the hegemonic norm in regards to what it means to be a lefty and the policies, and realizing that those policies, for 50 years, you've had a Democratic Party that tells you that the things that you wanted, the things that you believed in, the things that you knew and understood about the world, saying that the world is irrational. We should be working to the benefit of humanity and making our world a better place. And you had a Democratic Party, third-way Democrats telling you the public isn't on board for that. The public doesn't like that. Those policies aren't popular. Those aren't good policies. And maybe you can make that argument during the Reagan era, but here's the catch. Environments change. And as environments change and the conditions of the people in those environments, as they change, so do their political priorities. They find things to be fair or unfair. So you have a youth that has thousands, tens of thousands of dollars on their back, and you ask them, is that fair? They would say no. You go back to a Reagan era and have that conversation. Maybe that conversation doesn't take place because maybe that's not necessarily an issue for that era. I'm making the point that your environment changes. And as your environment changes, so do the individuals in that environment, their political inclinations. They change. So you get to this era, and you've had neoliberals, third-way Democrats tell you for 40, 50 years, incrementalism is the best that you can do. You got to take all of this money in order to get anything accomplished. And the best that you can get accomplished is small incremental stuff because you don't necessarily want to challenge the people who give you that money. That's what they've said. And that's what's soaked into the fabric of the individuals in our society, deadening their expectations, deadening their imaginations of getting anything done from the standpoint of what government can do. They haven't seen this notion of what government can do because they haven't been alive at a time where you had a party where government did anything. But here's the catch. Government is doing something. It's putting in policies that is expropriating the wealth from the lower classes to the top. Don't get in your mind that government is not doing anything. It is doing that remarkably well. Whether it's that Bush tax cut, whether it's Obama enshrining that tax cut in the law, whether it's Obama giving 95% of the income to the top 1%, it does that remarkably well, which is kind of my point. From the standpoint of the left, if you want to get policy items accomplished, they have told you that what you wanted was unpopular. And now you find out with Sanders running that not only can you run a campaign without taking their cash, not only that your policies are popular, not only winning the argument even in states that Sanders lost, your policy issues across the board from the standpoint of the Democratic Party was in line with what they wanted. And yes, they end up choosing Joe Biden. But be honest when you're thinking about what happened in this particular race. Every last element of the Democratic Party establishment lined up against you and your priorities in order to stop you and Sanders from exceeding the race. That is literally what took place. The media apparatus, the oligarchs, all of these things lined up against you. But here's the catch. You knew that going in. You knew that everybody who wasn't named Sanders going in was going to be against Sanders. What I wanted out of this was a ruthless, fanatical, righteous indignation with a sense of urgency that Sanders went after this particular election with the thought that I'm going to do everything that's possible to win this because everything else is subordinate to my cause. And what is that cause? 500,000 people losing their health insurance. 70 to 80% of the population living paycheck to paycheck. Persistently vulnerable. A quarter of the population of kids living in poverty. What is the life of a child who's growing up in that way? And what is the effect on society as that child grows up in that way? We don't think about these things, but these are things that Sanders put on the block for conversation, and you realize those things are popular. And yet they chose Joe Biden. And you ask yourself, why? Sanders was winning all of the other racial demographics, so you can't necessarily say it was an issue of people of color. He was winning people of color, except for African Americans. Sanders lost this race on the back of African Americans. Here's the catch. You can't blame African Americans. You have everybody has some level of strife and problems in their life. Doesn't matter the person. There's always something that plagues them. In the context of the thing that plagues them, they can't accept that as just an answer for them to not do X or to do Y. There are things in their life that they want to accomplish. You just have to overcome those things. My kidneys don't work. Fair enough. That doesn't stop me from traveling the world. Yes, there were things that you had to exchange. Sometimes it was cash, sometimes it was pain, sometimes it was feeling poorly. But at the same token, you had something that you wanted to accomplish. You had an objective, and everything else was subordinate to that objective. That's what I want. That's the way I focus on politics. And so when I look at Sanders, that's what I expect him to do in this race. But on issues of race, he would not bring up Joe Biden's line about civil rights. On issues of race, he wouldn't bring up the line about South Africa. He wouldn't necessarily bring up the fact that Biden is lying about civil rights and take a righteous indignation about it, where he's angry about it. I marched with King, and this man is lying about the civil rights movement. Would that be enough to win? I don't know, but don't you have to go there considering what happened? He lost 3-1 the black vote. Why? Because he's making an affirmative argument when really an affirmative argument was insufficient to get what he needed in regards to that race. That race was won and lost in South Carolina. Yes, Elizabeth Warren held Sanders down why Biden took the killing blow. But understand, that race was won and lost in South Carolina, and that was the exact particular play that Sanders would not be willing to do. Why? Because despite of all the pain and anguish that he is in this race to handle, Joe Biden is his buddy. Joe Biden is his buddy. Now he's out the race. No imagination in regards to what he could potentially do as a senator, as a leader of a movement in this moment of a pandemic. Can't change the campaign around, can't change and use his base and the leverage of that base to put a condition on whether or not they should support Joe Biden. Can't do any of that stuff. You automatically give it over. Bob, I am so pissed off. And I'm going to hand it over to you to get your opinion on this as opposed to just raging out.
Well, I think you have